one of the fallen angels of the Air Force. Well, pardon me if I show no sympathy. While you glamour boys were up in the wild blue yonder, I was down in a tank.
Listen, chum, sometime I'll be glad to hear the story of your war experiences. What I ask you for is a job. You got one?
Welcome to today's show. My name is John. As always, you can subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. You can follow the links to social media in the podcast show notes, so please subscribe when you're finished listening. You can also go to Classic Movie Rev to read notes, bios, and other random movie thoughts. Today's movie is The Best Years of Our Lives, 1946. This could be one of the greatest movies of all times. It's way up there and it's very important to me. The film is rated at 8.1 on IMDb.com. On Rotten Tomatoes, the tomato meter score is a staggering 96%. New York Times film critic Bosley Crowther said of the film, quote, "It is seldom that there comes a motion picture which can be wholly and enthusiastically endorsed, not only as superlative entertainment, but as food for quiet and humbling thought. In working out their solutions, Mr. Sherwood and Mr. Wyler have achieved some of the most beautiful and inspiring demonstrations of human fortitude that we have had in films." Unquote. He also said the ensemble cast gave the best performance in this best film this year from Hollywood. The director, William Wyler, joined the U.S. Army in World War II as a director. He made two important documentaries, The Memphis Belle, A Story of a Flying Fortress, 1944, and Thunderbolt, 1947. During the filming of The Memphis Belle, Wyler flew actual combat missions. Wyler made one major change to the film, shifting the focus away from PTSD and made the focus on the character Homer Parrish, played by a non-actor veteran that had lost both hands in World War II. The film was nominated for 8 Oscars, winning 7. The film won Best Motion Picture, Best Director, William Wyler, Best Actor, Frederick March, Best Writing, Screenplay, Robert E. Sherwood, Best Supporting Actor, Harold Russell, Best Film Editing, Daniel Mandel, and Best Music, Hugo Friedhofer. 2 more Oscars were awarded, Honorary Award to Harold Russell and Memorial Award to Samuel Goldwyn. This movie is interesting because the film started a little over 7 months after World War II ended. Not much time for reflection, but they seem to have nailed it. Actors.
Right, and I'm a Shakespearean actor.
This movie is where I first fell in love with Myrna Loy. Loy was such a popular star that she received first billing in the film's credit. Loy played the role of Millie Stevenson. Loy was first covered in episode 70, The Mask of Fu Manchu, 1932. Frederick March played Al Stevenson, the banker that left his family behind to be a sergeant in the Pacific Theater. March was covered in The Buccaneers, 1938. Dana Andrews was amazing as Fred Derry, who rose high above his humble beginnings during the war and fell back down following the war. Andrews was first covered during In Harm's Way, 1965. Kathy O'Donnell was great as the shy fiancée Wilma Cameron, who was engaged to a man that changed with the loss of his hands. O'Donnell was covered in Detective Story, 1951. Gladys George had a small but memorable role as Hortense Derry, Fred's stepmother. I just like saying Hortense. George was first covered in the great film noir The Maltese Falcon, 1941. Roman Bohannon played Fred's father, Pat Derry, a man broken by life. Bohannon was covered in Of Mice and Men, 1939. Ray Collins was in the role of Mr. Milton, president of the bank where Al Stevenson worked. Collins was covered recently in Command Decision, 1948. Ray Teal had a small role as a man saying the government had sold out the veterans. Teal was first covered in The Command, 1954. Pat Flaherty had an uncredited role as the salvage man. Flaherty was first covered in Key Largo, 1948. Teresa Wright played Peggy Stevenson, the grown daughter of a returning Army veteran. She was born in 1918 in New York City.
I'm walking here! I'm walking here!
Following her graduation from Columbia High School in Maplewood, New Jersey, Wright decided to become an actor. She began working in theater. While working in New York, she was scouted and signed to MGM. Her first role was in The Little Foxes. For this role, Wright received an Oscar nomination. Wright made it clear that she would not live the starlet's life and would remain grounded. Her second and third movies were Mrs. Miniver 1942, and The Pride of the Yankees 1942. She won a Best Supporting Actress and a Best Actress Oscar that year. Her fourth film was the Alfred Hitchcock-directed Shadow of a Doubt 1943, with a creepy uncle played by Joseph Cotten. Her next film, Casanova Brown 1944, slipped a little, but Wright bounced back with the mega hit The Best Years of Our Lives 1946. This was the last film on her contract, and for some reason they let her go. As a freelancer, the quality of her films generally decreased. The films include Pursued 1947, Enchantment 1948, The Capture 1950, Something to Live For 1952, California Conquest 1952, Count the Hours 1953, The Very Good Track of the Cat 1954, and Escapade in Japan 1957. Better films include The Men 1950 and The Search for Bridie Murphy 1956. By 1955, she was working mostly in television and did quite well. In her 50s, she continued to act on stage. Her last film role was in The Rainmaker, 1997, with Matt Damon. Wright died in 2005. Virginia Mayo played an unhappy military wife, Marie Derry. Mayo was born in Missouri in 1920 to a well-heeled family. Mayo began taking dancing lessons at her aunt's studio when she was 6, and when she graduated high school in 1937, she joined the St. Louis Municipal Opera. She was eventually signed to a contract by MGM. They gave her a small role in Hack London 1943. They wanted to try this rare beauty in more substantial roles. She was cast in The Princess and the Pirate 1944 with Bob Hope, and then Wonder Man 1945. She was starting to roll and continued in The Kid from Brooklyn 1946 with Danny Kaye. She was great as the cheating wife in The Best Years of Our Lives 1946. Mayo scored big in The Secret Life of Walter Mitty 1947. Yes, there was an earlier version, again with Danny Kaye. She really showed that she could work the dark side when she played the cheating wife to James Cagney's character in White Heat 1949. Other films include A Song is Born 1948, Backfire 1950 with Edmund O'Brien, Captain Horatio Hornblower RN 1951, and that's Royal Navy, not registered nurse. She worked her way through college 1952 and South Sea Woman 1953. However, it all ended quickly. In the 60s, she only made 4 films. In the 70s, only another 4 films. Her last role was The Man Next Door 1997. She died in 2005. Harold Russell played Navy veteran Homer Parrish. Russell has an interesting story. He was born in Canada in 1914. 5 years later, his family moved to Massachusetts. On D-Day, June 6, 1944, he was in North Carolina training paratroopers. The TNT he was using exploded and Russell lost both hands. He was given hook hands and trained to use them. The Army used him in a training film titled Diary of a Sergeant. Director William Wyler saw this film and decided to cast him in The Best Years of Our Lives 1946 as a returning naval veteran with hook hands. Russell became the only person to receive 2 Oscars for the same role when he won for Best Supporting Actor and was given a special Oscar for being an inspiration to returning veterans. He attended Boston University and was active in Veterans Affairs for the remainder of his life. Sadly, he sold his special Oscar to pay for his wife's medical treatment. Russell died in 2002 at the age of 88. Singer Hoagy Carmichael played Homer's uncle, Butch Engel. However, he mostly played the piano. Tennessee Ernie Ford was uncredited as a nightclub singer. Story.
Let me explain. No, there is too much. Let me sum up.
World War II has ended and the American servicemen are making their way back home. Army Air Corps Captain Fred Derry, Dana Andrews, is looking for a flight to Boone City. He quickly learns that money is king. I had always believed the city was Chicago. However, during the research for the show, I found out that Boone City was modeled after Cincinnati, Ohio. Fred gets a ride on a B-17 and there are already 2 people hitching a ride. They are Army Sergeant First Class Al Stevenson, Frederick March, and Navy Petty Officer Homer Parrish, Harold Russell. Fred was a bombardier in Europe. Al commanded infantry in the Pacific. and Homer had hook hands because he lost them when his ship was hit in the Pacific. Homer had been trained to use his hooks and is quite comfortable around the other men. They see a sea of junked warplanes as they land. During the flight and the taxi ride home, the three men bond over their experiences, their lost time, and their fear of returning home. Homer tells the location of his uncle's bar before being the first one dropped off. He wants to go for a drink, but Al says no. Homer is greeted by his mother, father, and little sister. When his fiancée, Wilma Cameron, Kathy O'Donnell, comes over, he won't wrap his arms around her.
You gotta hand it to the Navy. They sure trained that kid how to use those hooks.
They couldn't train him to put his arms around his girl, to stroke her hair.
Fred and Al drive on, and Al wants to drop Fred off first. Fred says no and drops Al off at an upscale high-rise. Al tells Fred he is a banker. Al surprises his son Rob, daughter Peggy, Teresa Wright, and his loving wife Millie, Myrna Loy.
Peggy! Rob, who was... I look terrible.
Who says so?
Isn't fair of you to bust in on us like this.
His family has learned to get along without him, and his children are grown. Fred goes to his father's Pat and stepmother Hortense's house. They are played by Roman Bohannon and Gladys George. It's a shack located near an overpass. Fred was dirt poor until the war gave him a chance to move up. Fred's whirlwind romance bride, Marie, Virginia Mayo, has been living with Fred's family, but he finds out that she took a nightclub job and got her own place. Fred heads out to his wife's apartment. Peggy takes her brother away and gives Millie and Al some time alone. They are very nervous. Al wants to go out on the town with Millie and Peggy. They hit a long string of swinging night spots. That's why I thought it was Chicago. I didn't think they had that many bars in Cincinnati. Homer's future in-laws come over, and they are very nervous about Homer's hooks. Wilma's father is speaking the Republican line about post-war depression. Finally, Homer excuses himself and goes for a walk. Homer ends up at his Uncle Butch's place where Butch, Hoagie Carmichael, is playing the piano. A slightly drunk Fred is asleep at the bar. Homer and Fred start drinking. About that time, drunken Al burst in dragging Millie and Peggy. Fred is there because he can't find where his wife is working.
Fred, come on, sit down. Hey, Fred, where's your wife, huh? I want to meet her.
I haven't been able to find her. She works in some nightclub here. I've been around to 4 or 5 places looking.
First, we got to get one thing straight. Homer lost his hands. He's got those hooks instead. But they don't worry him, so they don't need to worry anybody else. Right, Homer? Right. Right. Now let's get seriously to work.
They do some military-style drinking. Butch tells Homer that Wilma called, and he tries to get Homer straightened out.
Wilma phoned.
Wilma? What does she want?
You.
Oh, why can't they leave a guy alone?
Because they're fond of you, that's why.
Well, they keep staring at these hooks, or else they keep staring away from them.
You mean whatever they do is wrong?
With Homer, it's all about the hook hands. Drunk Al dances with Millie, leaving Fred and Peggy to get acquainted. Butch takes Homer home. When the others close the bar, they finally head home. They drop Fred at his wife's apartment, but he is too drunk to get inside. Millie and Peggy load him back up and take him to their home. That night, Fred has a nightmare about a burning plane. It is clear that he has not left the war behind. Peggy wakes him from the nightmare and stays with him while he goes back to sleep. In the morning, Fred doesn't remember the night before very well. Peggy fixes him breakfast and later drives him to his wife's apartment. Peggy and Fred bond more during the drive. Fred said he was a soda jerk before the war, and the one thing he knows is that he will not be going back behind the counter. Millie and Al get reacquainted. Marie Derry, Virginia Mayo, is happy to have Fred back, or so it seems.
Freddie, darling, why didn't you let me know? You can give me a chance to fix my face or anything.
You look all right, Dave.
Oh, Freddie, darling, I'm so excited. I can't believe it's you. Come on in, honey, where I can look at you. Oh, you're marvelous. All those ribbons.
Fred goes back to the drugstore where he used to work as a soda jerk to see the owner. The store has been sold out to a major chain, and they are under no obligation to rehire Fred under the terms of the Servicemen's Readjustment Act of 1944. Fred does not want to go back, and a kid that he trained as a soda jerk is now a floor manager. He is offered an assistant floor manager job. He turns it down. Mr. Milton, Ray Collins, calls Al into the bank and pitches him on the job of Vice President of Loans dealing with the new law to help returning servicemen. He wants him to go back to work right away. Marie quits her job and just wants to have a good time with the money that Fred has brought home. When he starts wearing civilian clothes, she is not too happy. Marie talks Fred into wearing his uniform to the nightclub where she has previously worked. Everyone is trying to make Homer feel normal, but he is pushing everyone away, including Wilma. While practice shooting, Homer gives Wilma the brush off. He also rages on his sister and her friends. That night, they show that when Homer takes off his hook rig, he feels helpless. Marie is still living the high life. When Fred says he is out of loot, Marie is not happy. She finally asks him about the dreams and if he's okay in the head. They have a fight and Marie is pissed. The next day, Fred takes the job at the drugstore, working under his old assistant, Dickie.
The perfume and cosmetics department is now our outstanding feature. It accounts for 34% of our gross intake and an even higher proportion of our profits. As you will readily surmise, our customers in this department are almost exclusively women.
Yes, I'd surmise that.
You must familiarize yourself with the correct pronunciation of all the perfumes and toiletries. For instance, here's a popular number, Rêve Romantique.
Yeah, that means romantic dream.
You speak French?
Well, I'll tell you, Sticky, just enough to make my way around the Paris bar.
Let's get one thing straight, Derry. The name Sticky is out.
Yes, Mr. Merkel, I understand.
At the bank, Al approves a loan for a Navy veteran that doesn't have any collateral. Two things convince him to make the loan. First is that he sees Homer conducting banking business. Secondly, he is convinced to give the loan based on the man's attitude, which just happens to be the same American attitude that won the war.
What'd you do, mostly?
Go in before the landings and clear the mines and underwater obstructions. Then when they'd taken enough ground for an airstrip, we'd build it.
Fairly interesting work, eh?
No, it got monotonous. Those islands all look alike. Until Iwo Jima. That was different.
So I've heard.
I'm a good farmer, Mr. Stevenson. Well, even during the war, I kept my hand in. I used to spend my spare time down on those little islands, working truck gardens, so my outfit could have fresh tomatoes and green corn and all that. And before the war, I was a sharecropper, like my father before me. Now, I feel I'd like to have a little piece of my own to work.
But not very sound banking. Fred is not happy working in the drugstore dealing with rich, carefree ladies and undisciplined children. One bad day, Peggy shows up to see Fred. They decide to meet for lunch. The pair really enjoy each other's company. In the parking lot, Fred plants a big old kiss on Peggy, and it makes everything awkward as she leaves. Al is called into Mr. Milton's office and told not to make any more unsound loans. After the chewing out, Mr. Milton explains how much he cares for Al. He also says there is a dinner at the Union Club that night. When Fred gets home, Marie is getting ready to go out. She says she has been invited by Peggy to go on a double date at Peggy's expense. Al is drinking heavily as he gets ready for the dinner. Millie tells Al that she thinks Peggy is head over heels about Fred. When confronted, Peggy admits she's in love with Fred. She hopes meeting his wife will cool her feelings. At the club, Mr. Milton gives a speech and introduces the pretty sodded Al. He makes a convincing speech about the need to take risks, and that is how we won the war.
I'm just going to sum the whole thing up in one word. My wife doesn't think I'd better sum it up in that one word. I think that little story has considerable significance, but I've forgotten what it is.
At the end of the speech, he has won the crowd over, and Millie is very proud of him. Peggy and her date are at another club with Fred and Marie. Fred and Peggy are both distracted by each other. Peggy's date has already caught on how bad Fred's marriage is. Fred tells Peggy that kisses will happen if they keep seeing each other. Marie says hi to an old friend, Cliff, Steve Cochran. In the ladies' room, Peggy finds out what a terrible gold digger Marie is. That night, Peggy comes in and tells her parents that Marie is terrible and she's going to break up Fred and Marie's marriage. Millie and Al say that their own marriage has had troubles and they were able to fall in love again. Peggy feels like a fool. Al arranges a meeting with Fred at Butch's place. Fred admits that he is in love with Peggy. Al says he will do all he can to keep Peggy away from Fred. Fred says he will not see Peggy again. Fred goes to make a call to Peggy and Homer comes in. Peggy is crushed by the breakup. Fred is working behind the food counter when a jackass customer, Ray Teal, orders some food. Homer comes in to see Fred and asks about the trouble with Al. The customer sees Homer's hooks and starts talking to him. He then starts in that World War II veterans were tricked and were fighting the wrong enemy.
We let ourselves get sold down the river. We were pushed into war.
Sure, by the Japs and the Nazis, so we had...
Oh, the Germans and the Japs had nothing against us. They just wanted to fight the Limeys and the Reds. And they would have whipped them, too. We didn't get deceived into it by a bunch of radicals in Washington.
I'm not clear what he's talking about other than one reference to radicals in Washington. Does he mean the Democrats? Does he mean the communists or the fascists? Anyway, Fred tells him to leave. Homer rips the man's lapel flag off and gets into a tussle. Fred gives the customer a nice right cross. Fred leaves his job for good. Outside, Fred tells Homer he needs to go ahead and marry Wilma. Fred says he will be the best man at the wedding. When Homer gets home, he finds out that Wilma's parents are trying to send her away.
Oh, Homer, why can't you ever understand the way things really are? The way I really feel. I keep trying to tell you.
He takes her to his room and shows what it is like when he doesn't have his hook rig on. Wilma's ready to get married anyway. Fred goes on unemployment. One day when Fred gets to his house, Marie is with Cliff, the guy from the bar. Marie sends Cliff downstairs to wait. Marie says she has given the best years of her life. She then says she wants a divorce.
I've given you every chance to make something of yourself. I gave up my own job when you asked me. I gave up the best years of my life, and what have you done? You flopped. Couldn't even hold that job in the drugstore. So I'm going back to work for myself, and that means I'm going to live for myself, too. And in case you don't understand English, I'm going to get a divorce.
Fred decides that he is leaving town. He drops his gear off at his father's place. His father reads his decorations and finds out that Fred has received the Distinguished Flying Cross. Fred goes to the airport and asks for a plane going in any direction. While he is waiting, he goes to the area where the junk planes are being torn apart. Fred climbs into the bombardier compartment of an old B-17. He has a flashback to the war and comes to terms with some of it. He is woken from his flashback by the foreman of the scrappers, Pat Flaherty. After they talk for a bit, Fred finds the planes are not being scrapped, they are being used to build houses. He also realizes that he is also not scrap and asks for a job. The foreman starts giving him grief about spending the war in the air while he was slugging it out in a muddy tank. In a great line, Fred says, quote, "Listen, chum, sometimes I would be glad to hear the story of your war experiences, but what I ask you for is a job," unquote.
Well, you can take your last look at these crates. We're breaking them up.
Yeah, I know. You're the junk man. You get everything sooner or later.
This is no junk. We're using this material for building prefabricated houses.
You don't need any help, do you?
Out of a job?
That's it.
I see. One of the fallen angels of the Air Force. Well, pardon me if I show no sympathy. While you glamour boys were up in the wild blue yonder, I was down in a tank.
Listen, chum, sometime I'll be glad to hear the story of your war experiences. What I ask you for is a job. You got one?
The foreman likes him and gives him a job. Sometime later, everyone is gathered at Wilma's house for the wedding of her and Homer. Fred is out with Homer, acting as best man. Homer says he was afraid Fred had left town and there would be no one to stand up for him. In another great line, Fred says, "I would stand up for you until I dropped."
Steady, boy.
Gee, Fred, you had me worried. I heard you were leaving town. I was afraid you wouldn't be able to stand up for me.
I stand up for you, kid, till I drop.
Al comes outside and it's a little awkward. Fred and Peggy keep making eyes at each other, even during the exchange of vows. After the I do, Fred crosses the room and kisses Peggy. He says it will take years for them to make it.
You know what it'll be, don't you, Peggy? It may take us years to get anywhere. We'll have no money, no decent place to live. We'll have to work, get kicked around.
She smiles and kisses him again. World famous short summary: the junk man gets it all in the end. Hope everyone enjoyed today's show. I really appreciate you spending the time listening. You can find connections to social media and email on my site at classicmovierev.com. There are links in the podcast show notes as well. Remember, this show is completely free and independent. All I ask is that you jump over to Apple Podcasts and give me a review. It really helps the show get found. Beware the Moors.